Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the offices here at Barty at Perry. For those that don't know me, my name is Dennis Lothar and I head up our property and planning team. I have a number of my colleagues who are seated in the room this evening from our planning team, Joseph, Peter and Monique at the back. Some of you may have had matters with them. You'll see them with the purple tags, but feel free to say hello to them after the presentation. Just a few housekeeping matters before we get started. Amenities for those who haven't been to offices are down the end where you came in on the left, so make your way there. Can we ask that all phones be on silent now, please? Would just assist us. And please stay afterwards for refreshments and for a drink and a chance to mingle with your colleagues. I want to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people, the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet tonight, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. As I noted earlier, Barty Perry is delighted to be associated with AIUS and to be sponsoring tonight's event. It's a long-standing relationship we've had with the AIUS, and there's many friends in the room, so welcome to all members. And as we continue on this relationship, just a bit about our practice for those who are not familiar with us. We work closely with clients both at local government and state level. We act for councils and property developers alike, so we've got a pretty balanced view on the things. We see firsthand the opportunities and the challenges that are involved in delivering housing in our state, which is something that we're all very close to all of us. The introduction of the LMR code has generated significant discussion, and we've seen it firsthand. We've had a few cases of late we've been involved in. Not too many judgments on interpretation of the controls yet, which is interesting. I think a lot of people are probably shying away from having a contested outcome, but nonetheless, it'll happen. But there's many issues associated with it and the interplay and the relationship between the controls and existing controls facing councils and developers alike. Now, with that, we're fortunate to have an outstanding panel joining us here this evening, bringing perspectives from both government, local council and the planning profession. Their collective experience and insights promises a thoughtful response and practical discussion on a really important issue facing the planning system in New South Wales. Now, before I hand over to Lynne, who'll do the formal introduction to our panellists, just a quick note for any of our council representatives in the room. Our Barty Perry Local Government Conference is coming up on the 13th of October. For any council members who'd like to attend, please let us know. We'll see one of our staff members after tonight's presentation. And for anyone in the room who'd like to be invited to our future events or to receive our articles, please visit our website, or there's also scan the QR code that will be displayed at the end of the session. But with that, you're here to hear about the LMR controls and to hear the different perspectives from our panellists. So I'm going to hand over to Lynne, who will take over. So welcome.
Good evening, everyone. Those that don't know me, my name's Lynne Sheridan and I'm the current chair of Australian Institute of Urban Studies. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you all here. It's great to see so many people and others online. I'd also like to thank Dennis very much and Barty Perry for hosting this beautiful and fantastic space that we're all standing and sitting in today. Before we begin, I just wanted to take a moment to share a few important updates regarding AIUS committee. We're delighted to officially welcome our newest committee members. We've got Sunil Duvney here, who's our Vice Chair. Thanks, Sunil. We've got Cody Sheridan, who's Treasurer and Engagement Strategy Lead, and Halva Dalheim, who a lot of you would know from the Department of Planning, who's joining us online. They join our existing committee members. We've got Michael here, Michael Newstein. We've got Phil Hull and David Wilmoth, and of course myself. So that's it for the committee and the committee update. One thing I would like to say is a really big thank you to Michael Newstein. Michael, you've been an absolute treasure for AIUS for so many years, being chair, is it for 16 years? Michael, so more than that. Yeah, well, I don't know how you did it, but you did a stellar job, and I'd really like to thank you. So can you just come up here for a second? I've got something I'd like to give you. Oh, if I can find it. Here it is. It's hiding. Just like to say thank you very much.
It's not true that I'm an alcoholic.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you so much.
And on a bit more of a solemn note, I'd also like to pause and acknowledge the recent passing of two incredible figures from urban planning, Professor Ed Blakely and Terry Burns. Both were members of AIUS committee for many years. They both made a profound and long-lasting contribution to urban studies and were stalwart supporters of AIUS over many, many years. Their legacy, wisdom and advocacy will be deeply missed by all of us. So, yeah, just a little tribute to them. As many of you know, AIUS is dedicated to fostering independent, non-partisan and multidisciplinary conversations about the issues shaping our urban environments. Right now, there is perhaps no more critical and intensely debated topic in New South Wales as the low and mid-rise housing reforms. These reforms are fundamentally reshaping our planning landscape, attempting to address an historic housing crisis by unlocking density in our well-located suburbs. But bridging the gap between statewide policy and local street-level reality is very complex, as we all know. That's why tonight's seminar is titled LMR Reforms, Progress, Pitfalls and the Path Forward. So to introduce our panel, we've got some amazing experts here. We've got state government, local government and industry on the stage. I'd like you to welcome our speakers. We've got Tom Loomes, who's sitting next to me, Executive Director of Strategic Planning at DPHI. Tom's really at the coalface of state government policy, helping to drive the overarching vision, strategy and implementation of these critical housing targets. I don't envy him, having worked at the department. It's a difficult job and it's always very controversial. So thanks, Tom. We've also got Scott Pedder sitting over towards the vacant chair there, Director of Planning and Place at Woollahra Council. Scott brings a crucial local government perspective, dealing firsthand with the challenge of integrating state mandated density while managing local character, infrastructure demands and community expectations. So thanks, Scott, for joining us. And then we've got Chris Johnson, who I'm sure everyone knows. He's a former government architect and former CEO of the Urban Taskforce, and Chris brings a wealth of experience representing the development industry. So let's welcome Chris. Thanks, Chris. And I've got a little bit of an icebreaker question for you guys, and I hope you don't mind. So just for a little quick warm-up, planners and architects and developers are notoriously famous for giving long answers to short questions. So I'm going to challenge the three of you right off the bat. In just one word, how would you describe the low and mid-rise reforms so far? We might kick off with Tom and then go from Chris to
the best. The best.
The best. Oh, well, there you go.
Undercooked.
Okay, this is going to be a good debate, Scott.
And ill-conceived.
Well, you're not going to get off as lightly as that, just answering in one word. So I'm going to start the first question for Tom. Tom, let's start with the big picture. Obviously, the LMR reforms were introduced with a bold ambition of rapidly accelerating housing supply. From the department's perspective, what does progress look like right now? And are you seeing the market and local councils respond in the way you originally envisioned?
I think the short answer to that question is yes. We are seeing the market respond in a very positive way. And I think we'd say we're seeing councils respond in exactly the same way that was anticipated when we first launched these reforms. Chris's point about them being undercooked, and I think it's good that he's in the middle between me and Scott tonight, is that, you know, any reform is like a careful balancing act about achieving an outcome in the most viable way possible. And I don't say viable as in generally the most feasible for the developers in the room, but for the outcome that can balance those needs of the community that's here today and the community that will be in these places in the future. And so the market is taking up LMR in places where housing is highly feasible at the moment. And that is in the eastern suburbs, it's in the North Shore, and it's in plenty of our places across Sydney, the Illawarra Shoalhaven and the Lower Hunter Central Coast. There are tens and tens of thousands of new dwellings in the planning system already as a result of LMR taking up those provisions. Some of them are stacking them with other bonuses and other provisions, which is great to see. That is the point of having bonuses. And I think we should embrace that. But the big picture is, why do we do it? Because when I joined the department in 2023, one of the big debates was how we're going to hit this housing target of 377,000 homes across New South Wales in 5 years. And the answer was, well, you can't do it with the current planning landscape. There was only a handful of years left in the system in terms of feasible housing capacity across this city. And if anyone's read the Productivity Commissioner's report that was released yesterday, the amount of reform that has happened, whether it's low and mid-rise, TOD, HDA, all of the state-led rezonings, we have significantly boosted that capacity to help us get to that target. We could have left it to the 33 federated councils across Sydney to help us get to that target, but the government chose one way, and that was a centralised liberalisation of planning controls, as the Premier said yesterday, and that is what we have done. And there is always more to do. So that is the path forward, is that there is always more reform. There's always the council contributions as well to be able to achieve that. Council's response, some are very positive, some are less positive, and that's okay. Not here to make friends, to be quite frank, here to deliver houses. But some councils have responded really well. And I see Vivian from Mosman Council here. Mosman Council is doing its own master planning in response to low and mid-rise, quite frankly, and they are putting forward a considered master plan for their area that seeks to achieve the same outcome as low and mid-rise by bringing more homes, a significant number of homes to their local area, and that is happening in a lot of council areas across Sydney, and that is a positive outcome. It might be a response, but it is a positive outcome to low and mid-rise in my view.
Thanks, Tom. Chris, got a question for you. Bringing in the industry perspective, DPHI has obviously set the stage with the reforms, but the private sector actually has to build the housing. Has the industry seen these reforms as a genuine win for feasibility, or is the needle not moving fast enough?
It's not fast enough to dive in there. I think I'll just go back one step or two. Some years ago, I had a big problem getting any opinion piece up and I was with the Urban Taskforce representing developers in the Sydney Morning Herald. And the only way I could do it was I did a joint one with the head of the Save Our Suburbs group, Tony Reshi. And we jointly, surprising to the minister and everyone, agreed that the fairly low rise 2-3 story, which at that time was proposed, was upsetting more and more people, but not really achieving significant amounts. And my position at the time, and still is, that if we're going to do it, don't do lots of little bits and upset people all over the place. Do bold bits in key areas that gets major outcomes occurring. Not dissimilar to Peter Atchison, the Productivity Commissioner's report. So what I'm finding is that the low is a hard one to pull off in a way. The medium rise, mid rise is something that I'm very keen on myself because I've written a book about it. I've done all sorts of stuff with the Urban Taskforce about it. We even put out our own version of a complying code, only 2 pages, to give quick planning approvals for it. And that's one of the things I think we should do. Just Victoria's already done it for mid-rise and try to make that happen. But my reading in the marketplace at the moment is there's a lot of concern, that councils are not happy about this, and Scott's probably leading the charge there, not you personally, but your mayor and others, about the low and mid-rise. And that's making it uncomfortable for a lot of developers and people, investors, to put money into projects where you've got a negative attitude already happening. But I think it's also the case that particularly in the mid-rise, which is basically up to 6 stories, and you've generally got to have lifts and you've generally got to have underground car parking as well. It's pretty hard in the current economic climate to make that stack up. Now, Peter Atchison sort of says it does, but when you look at his numbers, I don't think it proves the case at all. It does in the Todd developments around major centres and rail outlets, etc. I think that's racing ahead. But the low and mid-rise, my feeling is that the low is going to be difficult and the mid-rise at only 6 is going to be difficult as well. And if you look at the pattern book that the government's put out through the government architect, which I think is a good initiative, a number of those only go up to 4 floors. And this is economically getting quite hard. And if you read Peter Atchison's report that only came out yesterday, he's really, as a productivity commissioner, you'd expect him to, banging on about feasibility, what does work, what doesn't work. And his answer, he says, the only place we can really build a lot of these homes is where the values are high, i.e. eastern suburbs, North Shore, close to the city, inner west. Beyond that, it's almost impossible to make any of these stack up economically. So what he says, those parts of the city have to really take a lot of the push to get this more housing happening, because it's the only place that's going to be feasible in the current climate. He talks about the problem of building costs gone up 30% or so in the last couple of years. So we're in a very difficult scene. And I think speaking from Taskforce developer position, if you can't get them to be feasible, and what Peter Atchison says, a lot of them cost for an apartment $1 million to build it, but you can't sell it for that. So projects won't go ahead. So I think there's a really crucial issue with the mid-rise to really try to push it a bit higher. I think 8 floors is going to be essential, which is Paris, Barcelona, and half the world has already got this level, and to move in that way.
Thanks, Chris. Scott, if I can just move to you. Obviously, Woollahra Council operates in an area with high land values, significant heritage, and a very engaged community. How is your council processing these reforms on the ground? And have there been any unexpected successes or benefits you've seen at the local level so far?
Thanks, Lynne. I'll get to how we're processing, but I might say just at the outset, I think the real challenge, the big challenge for us, obviously, our environments are very high quality, very high amenity locations as they exist. So there is a context, and it's not just a built form context. So these are challenging from a whole range of issues in relation to how we look to add density. I think landing low and mid-rise controls in the way that they were done imagines there's no context. It's like there's a blank slate, and that's our real challenge, because there was no understanding or acceptance of the complexity of the environments in which you're landing these. So we've had, in the time since it's landed, we've received 30 local LMR related development applications, concurrently 6 state significant development applications which have gone into the department, and to date 22 of those 30 have been determined by the Woollahra local planning panel, so an independent planning panel. 21 have been refused, and we have 19 Land and Environment Court appeals on. So I'll get to, maybe a bit later in the discussion, get to some of the reasons why they ended there.
Yeah.
But they haven't been determined by our council laws. They have been determined based on the framework which we all work within. Mm-hmm. The challenge is that we've got a set of controls which don't relate to one another anymore. We have, and I know Dennis mentioned earlier, there haven't been any of our applications which have, I don't think, gone to hearing, but we have had a number of matters conciliated. So I think we've got 7 matters which have conciliation agreements in place, but we haven't got any CCs yet that I'm aware, just to give you a bit of a context of that. Some some of the interesting facts around what we've received, and maybe it's a reflection on exactly the location of Woollahra and the I guess the prime market, the quality of the market that we're dealing with. But over 70% of the applications combined have a 3-bedroom or bigger. And so it's a premium market with premium product. We're not getting housing diversity. We're actually losing housing diversity, and we're not getting affordable housing. So it's driving outcomes, but they are challenging the quality of our environments. And I think there's probably a way better way to do it. Ready?
Thanks, Scott. I've actually got another question for you. Just while we're talking about issues for local government, I suppose one of the biggest criticisms of the LMR reforms from local government seems to be the perceived loss of local planning control and a one-size-fits-all approach, which you sort of talked about a bit. What's the biggest pitfall of overriding your LEP, do you think?
Yeah. So in my notes, I've got here on the loss of planning control. I don't think it's perceived. I think that's how we're now operating. I think the things that Tom was talking about, and it was very clear in saying it. The government took the view in 2023 when the housing accord hit, that they were going to say, get out of the way, local government. We're going to do it. Leave it with us, right? I just don't think it's working. And I think that'll be the real challenge, because there hasn't been engagement with local government. It'll be harder to achieve those residential development outcomes, even the ones that Chris are talking to. So one size fits all obviously doesn't account for local context, as I've said. It's like it doesn't exist in these controls. And in terms of the biggest pitfall, I think the way that they are structured missed those 2 critical steps, which are in the apartment design guide. And I think, Chris, you might have been at the forefront of preparing that document back in the day. And part 1 and part 2, identifying the context and designing the typology control, were missed. And so we were landed with height and FSR, which have no. They don't sit in a framework. And so I think that's the biggest challenge.
Okay, thanks, Scott. And then, Tom, I suppose in response to that, how does the sort of state balance the sort of urgent need for housing with concerns that Scott's raised about local context and amenity, etc.?
Oh, look, I'm all for councils doing their own planning. That is an option available to councils at all times, right? And I think going back to my earlier point about the lack of capacity in the system across the city, and not just in Scott's area, does demonstrate that there has not been enough planning that has occurred. We are making up a gap, and that in this city, there has been a historical chronic undersupply of housing to the tune of almost 100,000 homes over the last 20 years. That has led to the crisis that we're in at the moment. And you can leave it to individual councils to solve the problem. You can leave it to a single department to solve the problem, or it can be both. And I would point at Canterbury Bankstown Council, who have done in the last 2.5 years an incredible job of demonstrating that they can do local planning and not have us come over the top of them. They have undertaken 6 major rezonings along the metro line in a very short period of time. And they have demonstrated that they can do that as quickly as we can. And so we have moved out of the way and let them do it. But when we're talking about local government areas where at the boom in 2018, they produced 22 new homes in some of the most feasible parts of Sydney. In others, it was 6 new homes. And that was at the height of the market, right? That was when we were delivering the most homes we've ever delivered in Sydney ever. And you are delivering, a baker's dozen of homes in one LGA and 22 in another. Like, I'm sorry, but there is a question mark that should should go over those LGAs, those councils, as to how much planning they're actually doing. And so I think as a good, responsible government, as good public servants who have to think about the public interest, if we're to close that gap, we do have to do something. And the low and mid-rise, Todd, state-led rezonings is what we are doing. And I would kind of challenge the point about the pitfall or the failures, because I look at the lodgements in this state, they're up significantly. They're trending far further up than they were in 2023. I look at the approvals, they are trending up far further than they were in 2023. And we have the highest lodgements and the highest approvals out of any state in terms of growth. So like, this is the point I would like to make, is that you might not be seeing the housing delivered on the ground straight away, but all the indicators that lead to a house being delivered are showing very healthy signs compared to where they were. And I feel, and I'll say this quite frankly and personally, that if we had left it to councils, we would not have that outcome occurring. And that's the tension that we have to manage. It's the decisions that we've made. And I feel that the department will continue to play a much stronger role in delivering these rezonings, delivering more planning reform into the future to maintain that we don't go backwards, that we don't have another 20 years of chronic undersupply, and that we create the space for industry to respond when the feasibility issues start to alleviate.
Thanks, Tom. Actually, on the question of feasibility, Chris, this is one for you. Even with zoning changes, developers are facing high construction costs, interest rates and labour shortages. From a feasibility standpoint, what are the current pitfalls in the LMR code that are stopping developers from putting shovels in the ground?
I'll just pick up on a bit of what Tom was saying a moment ago before I go into the detail of that. And that is, I went to a talk a month or two ago by the planning minister from Western Australia. And what was very interesting, he said we're way behind the eastern states in terms of moving to apartments. He used to be a mayor of a council, and he said, I'm not going to leave it to councils to start moving into this new type of dwelling that you all over in the eastern suburbs have got anyway. I'm going to have the state be responsible for driving the change. And I think when we get to crisis points like we have at the moment about supply, about trying to drive outcomes, you probably need a new different governance system to delegating to lots of smaller groups who are all there to protect the existing owners and their property values and not have other changes happening within that context. So I think it's appropriate that Chris Minns, and in the case I mentioned, the Minister for Planning Western Australia, can come in and intervene to say we've got to create this problem right now and make things happen. And as Tom says, I think that's moving on. And I think that's a very good thing. The difficulty that everyone's got at the moment is the economic one. And that is separate completely from whether it's local government or councils. Building prices have gone up dramatically since COVID, and all sorts of dramas happening overseas, Trump and things, and these are out of the control of the planning system itself. But that has led to big economic problems and financial problems, and that's exactly what the report that was put out by the Productivity Commissioner yesterday confronted. And what he said is that it's basically costing at least $1 million to do an apartment, but you cannot sell them for that amount in the western suburbs. The only place that you can actually sell them is in the eastern, the northern, the central areas, and the inner west. And so he said we have to focus, therefore, on these areas, looking at a macroeconomic issue across metropolitan Sydney to get housing to happen. If we can include, obviously, within that components, percentages of affordable housing, that's a positive thing. But he then said that we really need to start driving these outcomes in a much more positive way. He thinks that the planning system is not as fast as it should be. And that's where I come in and say, I think we need complying codes for buildings up to 6-8 stories to housing to get that to happen. It's exactly what Victoria has done recently. they've got deemed to complying development for that building type. This speeds up dramatically for a developer to get a project to actually happen. So we've got to look at multiple areas, I think, to trim down the time, trim down cost issues. There's obviously the overlay of the cost people have to pay for contribution plans and things like this. And it's the Productivity Commissioner looked at this as well. He doesn't think it's the major driver of slowing the industry down. But Tom's right that I think we've got a lot of interest, a lot of drive happening. And I must say the Premier, Chris Minns, has got to take a lot of credit for this. He's been very blunt about what he talks about. I mean, I've been to a number of talks where he's spoken, and one of the things he often says that I recall quite clearly is that on the measurement of the cost of housing per number of years, you've got to earn money to be able to pay for it. Sydney is the second worst in the world after Hong Kong. And then he says, in terms of densities, Sydney is 226 of the world cities. Is there a connection? And there obviously is. And this is why this drive to try to shift gear into another type of way to live. I live in an apartment. I used to live in a house. It's a different way of living. I've done lots of research when I was with the Urban Taskforce about why people live in apartments in Mosman and other areas, and downsizing. There's a crucial issue, of course, about the whole aging population, baby boomers like myself, often living in very big houses, how we handle those sort of issues. So my reading is we've got to get behind a shift to a more urban lifestyle. Even way back in 1967, Gough Whitlam gave a talk called The Urban Nation. And he said this is the way we've got to go. We've been a very suburban nation, and it's been fabulous. Everyone's loved it. We've had some of the biggest houses in the world. Surveys show that the McMansion houses are amongst the biggest in the whole world. I think we're now having to move to a different type of living, as well as balancing all of that with apartment living. And I think it's going to create friction. It's not going to be easy, but I think that the Premier, Minister and governments and Tom himself need to keep focused on that agenda.
Thanks, Chris. Now, before we open up the floor for questions, I'd just like to ask Tom, in sort of response to Chris, and having developed policy for the department for many years, no policy is perfect when it's first rolled out. As the department gathers feedback from stakeholders, have you thought about any potential refinements to the code, or, you know, whether there's, as Chris said, a potential for complying development code for sort of 6 to 8 story apartments? I was just wondering, you know, where the department's at with the code at the moment.
So since the day it launched, we've had feedback about legal quirks or changes to the policy to make it work better. And we have made a number of refinements since that time. You know, small things, big things, often in response to lawyers who are understanding the issues as they're helping their clients to sort of manage that risk. So I would say we're not closed off to change. I'd say we're very open to refinements. There is sort of no real plan to expand low and mid-rise at this point, but the government is very ambitious, and as you heard the Premier say yesterday, like, the foot is not off the pedal, and these 30 years of feasible housing capacity has to be generated somehow. I guess that's the challenge for Scott and the council staff who might be here tonight, is that offer is over to you, but there is always more the state can do, and that might be expansion of low and mid-rise. It might be changes to the development standards that are there already. And it may lead to a targeted assessment development pathway, which was one of the reforms in the EPNA Act amendments last year, or it could lead to code as well. But right now, we are very much open to the feedback and the changes that are required. And I guess, like Dennis said, we'll be watching the court as the court goes through some of its machinations on some of these, 19 refused local DAs in Woollahra, to see what the decisions are and how we can make the provisions work better. So that's the plan.
Thanks, Tom. And I think on that note, I'd like to probably open up the floor to some questions, because Tom's got to leave at about 6:30 for an important engagement. So I'd like to hear some questions maybe for Tom before he has to leave. So if people could put up their hands, and when I ask them to speak, if they wouldn't mind just stating their name and where they're from. And at that note, I'm going to go and sit down because I'm sick of standing. So yeah, who'd like to ask some questions?
There's one up the back there.
Yeah, I just had a question about feasibility. I'm an architect. I'm the director of Lockhart Krause Architects, and dealing with clients all the time. Feasibility is obviously very challenging. I was wondering if you have any ideas on how to manage that issue through modular, or Tom, or immigration, or any ideas on feasibility and how to improve it.
I'll speak. Sorry, Tom, I know you're on a time span, but look quickly. I think modern construction and prefab and all those sort of things, when the government's announced that they're going to head in this direction and set up a group, it obviously needs product that people are going to use. So someone like the social housing area, Homes New South Wales, is an ideal part to sort of try to get those sort of things happening. I've seen them going up at Macquarie Fields and Macquarie Park, rather, with incredible sort of whole units just lifted and crane and slotted in. So I think that's one area that may well help, but it takes a while to get it going. People like Nonda Katsoulides in Melbourne started setting up a whole factory and doing it, but he just couldn't make it work, not enough throughput. So that's one area. The area that the Productivity Commissioner says is just got to be higher. You need more density and more height to handle the feasibility issue. It's a pretty blunt economist sort of statement, but that what he says is, if it's not going to work at 6 stories, you need to go to 8, or in the around town centres and railway stations, if it's not going to work at 30 stories, we'll try 40. So he's pretty blunt at saying, in the current environment of economic difficulties with building costs, etc., and interest rates and all the other levels, you just are going to have to go higher. Tom.
So I think feasibility is obviously a very complex one at the moment. I think one of the biggest issues obviously is land value, and there's not much we can really do to fix that in the city at the moment. But like I am the son of an economist, and so that's sort of been like instilled in me right from the start, is it's like thinking about the value of viability is something that is in my brain constantly. So I think there is a really key cultural reform that needs to happen in planning, that the planning system is one of the greatest economic levers that we have, sort of outside of taxation and other sort of financial regulations. But I think that planning has often sort of put that mentality to the side and focused on what this building should look like and what this building should look like in its context, and not actually whether or not it could be built under the controls that are being proposed, which is a really fascinating thing for me, because otherwise we're just sort of designing these envelopes for absolutely no purpose. So I think planning, and Chris has quoted the Productivity Commissioner quite a bit tonight, but one of his key messages in that report, and what you heard from the Premier yesterday, is that feasibility needs to be considered very much alongside the other core planning principles of well located, amenity, design, all those things as well, to make sure that the thing that we're planning for, whether it's a single site, suburb, can actually be delivered. And in some cases that might be going higher, as Chris said, to be able to, I guess, meet that feasibility margin. And in other cases, it might actually be a lot smaller things. It might be adjustments to individual planning controls to make, the biggest concern that I hear at the moment is minimum lot sizes. Minimum lot sizes in this city are far too big for a lot of types of development, which makes it far too restrictive. And that if we had smaller minimum lot sizes, you'd be able to have more types of housing, and that would actually tip them from being a theoretical thing into an actual feasible thing. So I think that feasibility, depending on the submarket, is a really interesting concept. And I think planning's got to get back to, whether it's a council or it's our own people in the department when they're doing estate-led rezoning, an HDA, a planning proposal, actually considering that very much alongside all of the other key things that the Act prescribes, because otherwise we're just approving theory and not actually delivering a home.
Any other questions, Michael?
Sorry, I'll stand so that can be heard elsewhere. One of the problems, it seems to me, that bedevils this whole development argument is the standards, for want of a better word, but the guidelines supposedly of the apartment design guide. Now, they haven't been changed for a while. They were reviewed about 7 or 8 years ago. I thought the review was frankly pathetic, and it did not go far enough by any means. And we've embodied some. It's not just because you said it, Chris.
Okay.
I know you did, but we've embodied some standards that are a bit unattainable. Start going to a higher rise, and we have to somehow review those and attitudes to them, because we're going to end up with a much denser city. We need to do that, and I don't think the public understands that that's going to be the outcome. And we have to look at those standards, how we get good results for people on the ground, and still produce a much higher density of development. And there's an AIUS, on the AIUS website, there's an essay by the late Terry Burns, penned within about a month before he died, finished it. And he looked at some of those questions that are not being examined. We should look at the social questions as well to bring the public with us in making this a much denser city.
I might pick it up first off. Look, I agree totally with you that the ADG has iteratively got bigger and bigger and more issues that has got too confusing. I mean, there's a thing about solar access. I think you've got to measure it for 15 minutes at 1.2 meters above the floor level at a certain day in the year. It's some magic like Stonehenge or something sort of system to be able to design an apartment building. And I've looked at some buildings, for instance, if you've got a western facade, you can't actually therefore have a balcony directly off your living room, because it's the living room that has to get the sun in it, not the balcony, and crazy things happen. So I agree, it's too complex. The department put out very recently a whole issue a couple of weeks ago, or a few days ago, I think, that tried to clarify, and it's always very hard to do this, that it is only a guide. It's not to be taken as literal. We insist that people look at it as a guide. But I was a few days after that on a design review panel, and the chair, an architect, said, look, I know we're not meant to take it as literal, but I think we should still refer a bit to it. And it's going to be very hard to, after having had all those criteria about solar access, cross ventilation, etc., try to see them only as guides relative to ultimate performance. The other comment I'll just make is a number of architects have said to me that when the ADG was originally done, we didn't actually have the super high rise that we've now got. This above 30-story. I'm on a panel at the moment for an 88-story building in Parramatta. These are quite different circumstances to when the ADG was being done and thinking of what the product of apartment buildings was going to be. So I think there's a need to have a special section or something for super high rise. But I think also we need to reinforce that we do have to treat it as a guideline. And we've got to try to peel back people, councils, everyone, to say, look, let's try to achieve quality as much as we can, but not force it to become a negative on our viability.
Thanks, Chris. Tom, did you want to say anything? Or?
I'd just like to say that it's really nice that Chris read my practice note update.
Good on you.
It's very sweet of you. At least someone's reading it. I agree. I think the G in the ADG is lost, and that half the buildings in Sydney that are occupied by apartments today would not be able to be built under the current ADG. I live in a building in King's Cross that faces south, and it definitely does not get solar access on enough solar access on the winter solstice, but it is one of the best places to live. And I think we're kind of losing the wood for the trees sometimes with what we're considering as best quality design. And these are all things that should be treated as they are, and that is, it is a guide. I will not weigh in as to whether or not we should review the ADG. That is absolutely not something I'm going to put my hand up for.
I'll put my hand up.
Me too. Thanks, Tom. Any other questions out there? Gentlemen.
I've got two questions. Peter Smith, my name. I have two questions. I'm going to try and put them into one. First up, I think I referred to your guide or your memo in court the other day as a Captain Jack Sparrow kind of memo, kind of channeling kind of that it's not a code, it's a guide. Depends on which side you stand on, how you use the guide. But in New South Wales, we have a very interesting kind of scenario that's been going on for about 30 years. I call it the pendulum of planning policy, kind of where it swings from local government to state government. And sometimes it swings kind of from kind of application of policy that is statewide, it's local character versus kind of like planning by numbers. It swings in multiple different areas. We've seen recently in the past couple of years, Ku-ring-gai, Inner West, you mentioned Canterbury, Bankstown and Mosman move very fast and very nimbly, doing things that, for example, for Ku-ring-gai, I know has taken them 20 years to achieve. And they've done it in a matter of months. Kind of, we know us as practitioners, you can do planning proposals and planning strategies for an LGA, particularly with the technology we have now, very, very quickly. How come it's taken so long for so many councils, given that the LMR policy has been talked about since 2022, to actually change and actually, because the LMR is a very blunt policy, it's a blunt tool. Sometimes you need a blunt tool to get people to actually start moving. But how can we encourage local government to actually take the front foot and actually plan properly and efficiently for their area in a way that does respect the character and bring the community along in a meaningful way? I'd be interested to actually hear all three of your perspectives on that, to see both kind of like what carrot, what stick kind of can be used, what mechanisms could be used to encourage better and more efficient planning kind of in New South Wales.
Scott, do you want to answer?
I think that's a question probably for Scott.
Thanks, Peter. I think I'd start by saying it'd be great if the state government stuck to significant state-related matters and left local government to local planning. But to do that, you need a structure, you need context, and there had been a metropolitan strategy. Last year, the government released a draft Sydney plan to, and the old plan had a set of targets which everyone had to prepare plans and housing strategies, and they were all endorsed by the Department of Planning. Things moved pretty quickly, but this government decided that they didn't want local government to do the work, as Tom has said. They wanted to do that work themselves. But interestingly, in 2023, at exactly the same time, the Queensland government, when signing up to the Accord, said, we'll work with 61 councils to develop their local housing policy. They set the framework. They did the infrastructure planning, the big scale infrastructure planning to enable it, and the local governments delivered on the plans locally to get things moving. What this government did was avoid that. The plan that we saw last year had 3-year housing targets. Now, that hasn't been adopted yet, and Tom's probably got an announcement coming up in the next couple of days to say, you know, they're going to do something. But this is the framework that local government sits in, and the Mosman plan, and great work to them. I mean, it's a fantastic initiative that what they've done, but the minister's still saying they're not going to turn off low and mid-rise. There was a response to low and mid-rise, but the local government needs a context within which to deliver. And my view is that local government's the best place to deliver local planning. Set them ambitious targets, but make them deliver them, and I think they will. And I'm old enough to remember SEP 53 and those demands. I lived in Victoria, and I got told by my manager of strategic planning not to mention my history, like, you know, the fact that I'm talking about things that happened 30 years ago. But I remember Vic Code and Vic Code Urban, and that got overturned very quickly. This was a, you know, Jeff Kennett's government looking at very broad brush policy for housing density. That got overturned because of the lack of response to local issues and local context. And so they very quickly replaced that with local responsiveness, and that had to be delivered by local government. So I think the structure needs to be in place to enable it to happen.
I'll just quickly pick up a few issues around. But Peter, by the way, is the one who wrote our 2-page compliant development approach for the Urban Taskforce. So that's a fabulous document, and it still needs to be adopted, I think, Tom. I'll send you a copy. but just on the issue you said, my reading is that what the state government's doing from Premier on down is saying, look, we're in a crisis, we've got to make things happen. Don't just all, you know, say you're going to start looking at something, and therefore I'm going to threaten to say I'm going to do this, and the only way out of it is if you say, okay, we've got a better way to do the same outcome, same number of units. And I think a number of councils, and you've mentioned a number of them, are actually doing that. And I wonder, though, if the Premier and the government hadn't said we're going to barge this in, whether any of that would have happened. And so, in a way, I think the threat of this can actually get movement to actually produce alternative. I understand, for instance, in the West, they're looking at mid-rise actually up to 8 floors, which is, it starts becoming economically viable in the West by doing that. And that's a really good outcome, I think. Tom, over to you.
Yeah, look, Peter, I think your question is great, because as Scott said, we had a Metropolis of 3 Cities plan, you had district plans, you had local strategic planning statements, and then you had local housing strategies, and they all had actions in them that needed to get done. And those actions were, we're going to deliver rezoning of Gordon in Ku-ring-gai, Linfield in Ku-ring-gai, Roseville in Ku-ring-gai, and, you know, that local housing strategy is like, I don't know, 6 years old, and how many of those were done by the time that the Todd and low and mid-rise were even, you know, conceived? Absolutely zero. So, you know, when we went through and did these planning policies that are, you know, apparently pitfalls, we did look at what had not been done or even started from those local housing strategies, places that councils had identified where more homes should go, right? And places that councils had committed to doing work within a time period and had fundamentally failed to do it. And so that is why those places are TODs and why they're low and mid-rise centres. Not because I picked names out of a hat and my team thought that's a great place to do it. It's because they're on a strategy that a council wrote and hasn't done anything about. In some cases, their council had done something there, but it wasn't having the effect that council had wanted. And so we also applied the controls there. But why are councils reacting to this? You know, I think Chris is right. Like, the sword of Damocles is a great way to get things done. Like, and sometimes when the sword falls, it actually makes things happen a little faster. I think you can see that happening, and you can actually see councils now finding other places to proactively starting to plan, which is really positive because that's a cultural shift. I think you're right, there is a pendulum. You know, in 2019, Rob Stokes handed all those precincts back to councils to do the planning. And one of them is my favourite one is like St Leonard's Crow's Nest, the 2036 plan, which we know we had a lot of fun doing that in 9 months in 2024, right? So the department did it, achieved it because the 3 councils there couldn't get a planning proposal together to do it collectively. So we are in the pendulum swing. I think the difference this time is that there is a whole generation of people locked out of housing, and those people are voting now, and they're making decisions at the community. They're having their say when it comes to applications that are coming through the system. And I think that there is a greater desire from that generation who are going to struggle to get into the home ownership market unless they see quite seismic changes in how supply is delivered. And that means that I think that the state's going to have a lot longer role to play. At least I hope so, because I think that is how we shift ourselves out of this problem.
Just pick up one other issue. I don't think it's just a swing. I think there's a structural issue in the accountability of the planning system. And Glasgow Jacqueline got Glenn Stevens, after he finished as Governor of the Reserve Bank, to do a study on how on earth to get more housing happening. And he ended up saying that local government will not do it because their fundamental interest is to respond to the existing people who are voting them in and making sure they remain in power. No one's representing, in his opinion, Glenn Stevens, the future people coming in, the arrival, etc. And in a way, he argued the only people can do it are, in fact, the state government, to take a bigger scale picture. And so I think the pendulum only moves when there's failure at the local level to pick up the population growths, the future generations, intergenerational equity and these sort of things, then has to come back in to put greater pressure on the system.
I think I disagree with you.
But that's good. We need a bit of disagreement.
Not surprisingly.
Disagreements.
Exactly. And I think the leaders in local government do want to see density. I know that our council does, and our mayor is keen on seeing density, which is done well, in an environment which is already very dense. And so we're looking at an area of Woollahra which the government wants to put 10,000 dwellings in an area which already has 8,800 dwellings, 4/5 of which are multi-dwellings, right? And somehow they think that that might be a good idea, which sounds like a fantasy to me, right? But I think our councillors understand that we need to be providing it. And we've got a great environment which we want to see increased density. And I think we've had, like in the last 2 financial years, we've approved $1.5 billion of construction work, or determined that much. We're not saying no to development. What we want to see is appropriate development, and we want to be able to set the scale, set the parameters in which it can be delivered in a feasible manner. And that feasibility question is a big part of that. Setting lower mid-rise policy which doesn't really consider context. We'll see the work that we've had done for us by some of the leading feasibility analysts has indicated that it's not going to deliver. And that's the real challenge here, because state thinks they can, they don't have the local understanding. And I think that's the real challenge. I think set them the challenge to do it, and I think you'll see it happen.
Scott, I think you've answered my next question, but I'm going to ask you anyway, because it's going to be a question for all 3 panelists. If you had a magic wand and could change or implement one specific thing tomorrow to ensure the LMR reform successfully delivered housing, what would it be?
I think I had delete them, Lynne. And I could run through the list of reasons why these things are getting refused. They're not working. They're completely dysfunctional in my view, because the context in which they have been placed, and I know Tom really wants to get things moving and, you know, get density and all that sort of stuff. I just don't think they're using the right tools. And I think state government should be doing state government stuff. Local government should be doing local planning. And I think then you'll see some better outcomes delivered quicker. And that's my personal view, having worked in the department with you, Lynne, on some big challenging issues, and understanding local government. But I think just to dismiss local government as NIMBY, I think is irresponsible. I think the challenge needs to be set, and I think you'll see people like as Osman have done step up. The real challenge is that we don't have a context in which to do it because the government have been doing local planning badly.
So Scott, just like maybe in response to that, instead of like maybe just deleting low and mid-rise, like what's the alternative? Because you've said you don't want the state government doing local planning. So are you going to do local planning? Because I guess that's the question is we've picked these places.
Yeah, I said that. Tom. But I think you set density challenges. You can set density challenges. Yeah, you can set targets for sure. But understanding, the environments within which you're doing that. Understand. I think there's a role here for state government, the Department of Planning, to understand a lot better what exists in current zoning right across the metro. And I don't think that's clear. And I don't think there's an understanding in the department right now of what the zoning controls mean in different local areas. And I think if, looking at a city like New York, who have a very, very well-established, typologically based set of zoning controls, which aren't just a land use. The zoning controls relate to all the things which, part 1 and part 2 of the old Department Design Guide did, which was understanding what sort of typology can achieve what sort of outcomes. And I think there's a role for the government to understand that a lot better than they do.
But to my point, Mossman, Vivian, has proposed an alternative plan to low and mid-rise, which is, in my mind, a solutions-based mindset to a problem that her community feels is the low and mid-rise. Is there a solution that Woollahra has to, say, Rose Bay or to the other LMR areas in your LGA that is not just saying no?
We would have loved that challenge, Tom.
I think you had plenty of years to do it, but
no. Let me just address that point. I think, as I said, there have been targets set by each consecutive government over the last, I don't know how long. Woollahra was meeting it was in excess of its targets. They weren't very high, but the density was being achieved, and there was feasible development happening. Some of that feasible development right now has ceased because of the lower mid-rise controls, and also because there's the potential of a rezoning for 10,000 dwellings around a station, right? So all that has ceased. So there are holes, there are hoardings, and there is no development happening. And these sort of, I kind of get really frustrated by the idea that, this grand solution has somehow resolved everything. I just think that the government's gone about it the wrong way.
Can I just add a bit in here that some years ago I got McCrindle, who do demographic research, to look at what is the future about the mix of houses and apartments in Sydney. And it was quite surprising, and it all comes from the census, which we're about to do right now around Australia. But it used to be, 10, 20%. It's got up to about 35, 37% at the moment. And his projections were within around 2050 or so, 50% of the people living in Sydney will be living in apartments. I think a lot of people living in houses are threatened by this. They think that Sydney is about houses, the detached house, the beautiful quarter-acre block. This is the way we all brought up. And so there's a change happening across our metropolitan area that is uncomfortable for many people. It's not the existing context, and the context is changing. And it's changing not just as a planning issue, it's economic. The Sydney Morning Herald's domain section has the average house across Sydney 1.6 million, the average apartment half that, 800,000. The affordable housing for the future is in apartments. So this is got to be taken on, and basically apartments mean greater density. And that means the character and the context is going to change. And we have to manage that, I think, as well as we can.
Look, that's not a new issue, right? Like, I'm not as old as Chris, but you know, like,
Yes.
no, not yet. But you know, I live in King's Cross, and King's Cross in the 1930s was a lovely bunch of maritime mansions, some of which still exist. And this struggle that Chris just outlined about moving from beautiful, big, freestanding homes to apartment living was what was happening in the 1930s and the 1940s as more and more apartments were being delivered. And there was this struggle between the existing community and the community that will live there, the future. One of whom is me, and I'm benefiting from those decisions that were made. And, you know, the Sydney Morning Herald published at the time that there was like this antagonism towards this like ant-hill-like living approach. And I would say that that ant-hill-like living approach has produced one of the best suburbs to live in, with high amenity, high density, great accessibility. And I think that we have to be cautious of that tension, but we should also embrace it because it can produce the best places to live in the city. And I think anyone living in King's Cross, Potts Point, Elizabeth Bay would say that about that, and that there would be no regrets from the people that live there now, almost 100 years later, about the decisions that were made in the 1930s to move from mansions to that apartment living.
But I think, Tom, that area was at the front end of this change. And it's now rippling across many other parts of Sydney, including Parramatta and out to the west and other areas. And that's the tension that is actually occurring. So I think there's a real communication issue and people positioning the value of this lifestyle and an approach, including its affordability and costs, etc. So it's a tension that is going to happen for the next decade or two.
Thanks, Chris. Can I ask, is there one more question that someone would like to ask of Tom before he needs to leave? Because he needs to leave shortly. The lady.
Okay, hi. Jennifer Hill, I'm a heritage urban consultant. I was going to ask the question about King's Cross, so you beat me to it. But what I want to know is when we've got an outcome within a 24-year period increased by over 600%, the number of dwellings was well considered then, is well considered today. Are we looking at that as a typology for how we would be studying this? How does that work, and is that informing what we're doing with the LMR? Because you've got heritage items set within contexts that are 8 to 11 stories and work extremely effectively. And a slight question for Scott is, Ku-ring-gai is reviewing some of their heritage items because their setting is completely changed as a result of TOD and LMR. Is that something that Woollahra Council will be doing as well? But your answer first, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, look, I think there is a great way to integrate heritage into high density living. I think there's some great examples in King's Cross. I think there's also some bad examples. So, you know, like I think there's some lessons in all of that. But really, I think what's happening in Ku-ring-gai is the example that you've raised is that some of those isolated heritage items between, you know, new buildings that are proposed either under our scheme, under that council scheme, I think there is a better way to integrate those in, and you're seeing some of those developers do that as well, which I think is positive. It obviously adds, it keeps the character that a lot of people are quite anxious about, but also some of those heritage items that can't be like properly integrated into the built form of a new apartment building can add great deep soil plantings. They can add great private open space. There's some great examples across the inner west of that happening as well, like in Marrickville, the Mirvac development there. So I think part of that is not saying that these things can't work together, because they can. And we should be looking at how we can embrace them working together, and encouraging developers to see their value into how they might need to meet some of the metrics that under the much wanted ADG or under some of those other requirements under council's DCPs, etc. Because I would say that there is always an opportunity to integrate the important fabric of a place into the future fabric of the place.
Can I just ask Tom a question? No, Tom, I think what's happening is a need for government to be promoting this more urban lifestyle, the direction we're moving. But when you look at television, etc., grand designs, or the block, everything is about a house. It's never about apartment living. Even the Institute of Architects, I've looked at it recently, and most of the awards go to individual houses. Apartments are left in the sideline. So somehow this emerging to a more urban lifestyle needs to be promoted in a positive manner by government, by media, and all of us.
Look, I don't disagree. I think the challenge is until sort of the last 3 years where we've been having this infill conversation more openly, it's becoming more sort of normalized amongst the community, is that we have just been building out on the urban fringe for the last, I don't know, 20, 30 years at pace. And look, that's an important part of Sydney's growth, but in the last 3 years, we've started to reshape that. And that's where all these policies have come in. I think what you'll see is as we have more and more density, as we have better examples, as we change the urban fabric of Sydney so that it is, you know, it goes from high to medium to low back to high again as we go between centres and stations, not just this high down to low as we get to the urban fringe. You'll be able to talk about those things more positively. Yes, the government has a role to play. I think they've been very open about density needing to be a thing that happens. They've been trying to promote what good density looks like. The pattern book is a great example of some of those potential visualizations. But until we start to see more and more of these things occurring, I think it will be tough for people to understand, especially if they're not from a community that has that kind of.
I know a quick example in Inner West, they set up a group like the HDA to fast track projects, including the general manager, director of planning and the senior council, but they added a city architect to it to give a signal that in moving for greater, quicker, more approvals, more housing, more density, it has to be done incredibly well. And I think that's a very positive way to do it. And it's great, of course, the government architects involved in running that whole competition, etc.
Yeah, if I can just, I guess it's been a fairly high level conversation. We've seen some very detailed development applications coming in, and just wanted to highlight some of those, and which I guess maybe shed some light on just how blunt the low mid-rise controls have been. So we've got some fantastic. There's an application currently at Edgecliff, which proposes to get rid of demolish 28 fairly low cost accommodation. So fantastic houses. Yeah, 3 RFBs. Oh yeah. 3 RFBs which have 28 units within them, and a fantastic set of. They're not heritage quality, but they are fantastic inner wall flat buildings. This proposal proposes 29 dwellings, and it has a few extra stories, right? But it won't be 1 and 2 bedders or even 2 bedders in the main. It's 3+ bedrooms. So that the bluntness of this control distorts what the objective of trying to achieve better. The things that you're talking about, those places are fantastic, and they serve a part, very much a part of our housing diversity requirement, particularly in our area. They're lost. We had, I'll give you another example while Tom's still here. We had a development in Darling Point, an application which replaces 4 dwellings with 3. They're probably going to be over $25 million each, right? But they got the benefit of they're just marginally within the 800 metres of Edgecliff Station. They got the benefit of an extra story. So they put the extra story on, no additional dwellings, because there's no objectives for these controls. This is how blunt they are, right? And so we're not getting the outcomes we need. There's no level of sophistication with what they've done, and I think that's the real challenge.
Well, I think Tom needs to fine tune the system a bit then. So,
well, I think there are better people.
So you get
in
diversity,
local government to do it.
Diversity, and you need greater units. I mean, we're trying to solve a housing crisis and build more homes, and if the end result's not to do that, it seems crazy.
I think we've got time for just one more question.
Tom's just got an answer.
The beauty of the LMR is that it only overrules council's controls on very few controls, right? Like it doesn't eradicate the DCP, it doesn't write the LEP off. It says on these controls, floor space, height, sometimes parking controls when it's in the low rise, these prevail over the LEP. All the other LEP standards, all the other DCP standards are still relevant for assessment. And so if Scott's council had a no net dwelling loss policy, then
which we have a planning proposal in with the department, which has sat there for 6 months and you've done nothing about it.
And the city has had theirs in for years. And I feel like if there was some foresight on these issues beforehand, it could have been resolved a lot earlier. But it's not eradicating all local planning controls as Scott's made out. It's only overruling a few of them, and it's the power's in your hands, Scott.
I think if we had a compliant development, though, you would say you have to increase number of units, clause 7.6, etc.
Send it to Tom. One more question from the floor. Anyone from a council that wants a question?
The lady here with her hand up.
Yeah,
Oh,
this
sorry, I
is
didn't
really
see.
sort of in line with
You can just
housing.
stand up and say your
No,
name.
I don't need to stand up. It's okay.
Or say your name at least.
Sue, hi. I'm from Heritage 21, but it's more about, you talk about housing, you talk about that, which is great, but how are you working with infrastructure? You know, people may be against it because it's great to have that. It's great to have the unit and you have all these units because there's no parking, but there's no public transport. There's no way for them to get around. How has that been incorporated in with all the planning?
So the beauty of lower mid-rise in Todd is that transport access was the key criterion for how we chose places. They are typically on a heavy rail line, a metro line, a rapid bus route, a regular bus route, a light rail route. So if they didn't have those things, they didn't make the cut. So I would say that probably isn't really an issue for low and mid-rise, unless.
Well, what I'm suggesting is, couldn't you use that and infrastructure in other areas where you've got that, you could have that growth? So you've got some places where there's a lot of growth, there's a lot of things happening, but you don't have the infrastructure. So you could actually have more housing and affordable housing in certain areas. So you actually work
I'll
in
just
line.
point out, just on that point, that is an issue in the Camden Heritage Conservation Area.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Like there is no transport infrastructure there.
And just to add on, the Northern Line, most of the stations stay flooded most of the times and they are not accessible. One of the stations I have particularly used, throughout 24 hours, there were only 5 people who used that station.
Which means it has great capacity for
It does. It's not accessible. That's the issue.
Anyway, the development industry is ready to come and help.
Land speculation is happening. a
look,
lot.
in terms of infrastructure, so we have this great program, it's called the Urban Development Program. It manages growth and the infrastructure that's required to match that growth. It's an annualized program. It publishes an infrastructure opportunities plan and it works across government, coordinating government agencies as to what infrastructure is required at what time to help that growth continue. There's also obviously local infrastructure, and we've been encouraged councils to do 712 contribution plans to match some of that growth that might be occurring in some low and mid-rise areas. Some councils have done a really great job of implementing those, and glad to see them. And I would say that infrastructure was also a very key consideration of some of the reforms that we've done. And we were very alive to some of the key infrastructure capacity issues, particularly in Western Sydney, before we proceeded with any major changes. And you'll see that because the low and mid-rise, if you look at the map that we've published on the website, you'll see that the vast majority of them are sort of east of Strathfield, right? Where we, through an infrastructure assessment with INSW, established that there was a grander issue of infrastructure capacity west of Strathfield, and that then knocked a lot of places off, and doesn't mean they can't be revisited, but it just means the infrastructure's got to catch up before you can bring in that sort of growth into those places.
So wouldn't it want to encourage that then? So we have more housing in those areas?
Oh, absolutely. But, you know, some of these places already have housing envisaged there. They've got things like caps on the amount of homes that can go there until the infrastructure is being delivered. Look, the infrastructure is being planned and funded and in the process of ultimate delivery, but it would be irresponsible for me to go and put a policy on those places that breaches that cap, or breaches sort of what the capacity could be in the near term, compared to places where we've got an assessment that says there's capacity here, and with a few small tweaks and, you know, ultimate upgrades to schools and public parks, etc., you know, like they're the ones to go with. If you don't have water and sewer and you're not going to have it for 15 years, I probably shouldn't put, you know, more homes there.
Tom, I understand you've probably got to leave now.
Yeah, it's my mum's birthday. I'm going to get shot.
Well, that's
As much
important.
as I love talking about housing, I would fear for my life.
They probably don't think this. I don't blame you.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for coming
Thank
along.
you.
It's been a great discussion. We can certainly continue the discussion.
Yeah. You can
Thanks
talk about
again. Thank you very much. Any questions, maybe for Chris, industry, or for Scott? Any other questions?
Michael's got one.
Another go, Scott. One of the problems that it's not a Woollahra problem. There are some Woollahra issues that I can, and we'll look for you later. Later.
Have you got an application in?
One of the problems really in terms of feasibility, and I say that with the economist's son having just gone, is that as housing costs go up and infrastructure costs go up, the proportion of taxation of new dwellings is rising. So really, in terms of making things feasible, the government's working against itself when it takes more in both GST, state charges, stamp duties, and the councils, of course, with their 711 and 712 contribution scheme. And they're not reducing those in the face of the lack of the affordability crisis in housing. So really it's one arm of government, the revenue collection arm, working against the planning arm by raking in more dough. And they, if in Woollahra, for instance, you can sell a new 3-bedroom place for 7 million, they're very happy. Their stamp duty is wonderful.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's a great point. I do think the contributions framework needs to be revisited, and I think there's work to be done in value capture, which we don't do.
Which we need to do.
Which we need to do. And you look at some of those applications that I spoke about earlier, where there were massive windfall gains, and that doesn't happen everywhere. And it's not to, you know, most developments, it's difficult to put them together for the LMR type sites. But you're exactly right. The charges are getting steeper. These aren't things necessarily that a council can fix. So we're at the bottom of that.
That's GST is a fix.
So we're at the bottom of that food chain. But I seriously believe that we need to revisit, this government needs to revisit the infrastructure contribution scheme framework and look to much better solutions. And I think further imposition of transport related levies on top of the housing productivity requirement with 712s, and Tom's talking about increased 712 plan percentages. and Suhu raised infrastructure requirements. They're getting more and more expensive to provide. We, you know, and I guess that's another debate, which I'm sure you'll look into.
Can I just add a couple of things too? Because I think that we are very lucky in Sydney at the moment that there has been investment over the last 10, 20 years or so into metro systems, light rail systems, and setting up the city for this shift to a more urban lifestyle with less reliance on cars, which you have to have in a low density spreading city. So I think, you know, Gladstone Jacqueline's a person who really got a lot of this going, and that's a very positive sort of outcome, I think, for infrastructure to allow the sort of city. And then if you think about that compared to London and to New York and other major cities, that's exactly Paris, the underground, etc., that gives them the rationale for not being car-based and things. And I think that's another threshold that the city is at, and part of what the government's trying to drive connects to that sort of scenario as well.
David, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was going to, on that theme, I was going to ask Tom there. So I'm David from Strategic Perception. I was going to say that I mean, it came up when Sue mentioned it around transport. You know, it's more than just Sydney, right? We've got a New South Wales housing crisis, and I don't see any transport planning happening. I mean, we've got a metro heading out west, which is designed and under construction. There's some talk about it maybe going east. There's a high-speed rail discussion that seems to go $1 billion every week, and see how that's going to be feasible. You know, people could live within commuting distance of Sydney in apartments or houses or a whole variety of different built forms, but it takes an hour and a half, 2 hours to get to Gosford. You know, I don't see this transport, this really strategic transport planning happening. I think that's part of the solution we need to be just discussing as well.
I'll just pick up on that. Look, I tend to agree. There's often been talk about wish lists for a great fast train right down the eastern coast, but I doubt that's ever going to quite get here. I don't think our populations are just going to be enough to do it. I mean, Whitlam, when he talked about an urban nation, said I think 89 or 86% of Australians live in urban areas, 100,000 or more. It's now 92%. But I looked it up the other day and it covers 0.22% of the land. And that's a problem in Australia in terms of getting interconnections between the country towns and various areas. There's so much empty land along the way to make that work. However, I think the eastern seaboard from Newcastle to Wollongong and through Sydney and things is one that can work a lot better. And I think that as we start growing Central Coast, etc., that's a real potential, and you know, more needs to be done in that area, I think.
I'm just going to ask, why does affordable housing in LMR developments only need to be provided for 15 years and not in perpetuity?
That was about affordable housing and the fact that it's only provided for 15 years, not in perpetuity. Yes, you got any comments on that?
I'll just make a comment. When I was with the Urban Taskforce, we actually did propose a policy like that on the basis there will be a continual turnover of new projects that will have affordable housing over 15 years. And when we're looking at that issue, I spoke quite a lot to the community housing providers, and most of them have people in there for 7, 8 years or so. It's not as though they're there forever. Social housing is different, and that's a different circumstance. So the thought was that there would be a continuing series of things happening that way. Obviously, that's balanced with, you know, long-term, forever affordable housing. And then there's the bigger issue again of social housing. All very complex issues to try and get working in that area.
And from our council, our affordable housing policy says that affordable housing should be in perpetuity. And I think with inclusionary zoning, if you get those benefits, that should be the case. And that should be part of the analysis that we're doing in terms of what's feasible, what are these things enabling. We've, again, if I gave you some examples, we've got one development in Rose Bay, which got an additional story under the affordable housing bonus. It wasn't LMR, it was just in the business line. The affordable housing unit is 100. It takes up the whole floor of the building. It has 3 bedrooms, all with en suites and walk-in robes. And by any measure, there is no one who would be, based on market rates. Well, three bedders are not affordable in Woollahra, and by any measure that wouldn't be an affordable. But they got the benefit of that dwelling for a 15-year affordable housing period, and it's quite extraordinary that we're enabling these things through these controls. I just, I think that needs to be revisited.
Certainly something that needs to be looked at. So are there any other questions? Because I know that, one more from Sunil, and then I think we'll have to wrap up.
Exhausting everyone.
I'm exhausted.
Thank you, Lynn. Question for you, Scott. We heard a lot about the tension or competing tension between the state and the local council. 3 weeks ago, I was interviewing the Deputy Mayor of Paris, who's responsible for delivering housing. Their next 5-year target is close to 600,000 homes, which is set in their legislation. What was really interesting about this target, that they have design standards embedded in their legislation for affordable housing, which cannot be any lower than the market condition. How do you see these issues would be solved when there's so much of tension with the community, with the current state government reforms, and of course the councils? How is the community ever going to benefit from the word quality living, which I see very clearly on an evidence basis, in fact, is declining?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't think I've got all the answers. But I do think there'll be a tipping point. I think that the role of each level of government in Australia should be taken seriously, and I think that this state government's approach isn't something I'd necessarily agree with, and I think that'll change. I think people will see that it's not delivering. It's certainly not delivering the amenity and quality that we all expect and should expect in terms of the quality of our development. But and to Chris's point, I think there will be a move. And I've got 2 grown daughters who are living in Sydney who are finding it hard to find an accommodation. They'll gladly live in an apartment. That is part of how they see the future. Young people are changing the way we're looking at these things, and I think that will evolve, and we'll see more development in that way. But I think there's a lot of work for the federal government to do in terms of taxation, in terms of their responsibilities, which we're not really seeing. I went to a talk earlier in the year, might have been late last year, and I heard the Minister for Housing speak, and she said councils have got to do more. And I'm thinking, there's only so much we can do, right?
So on that note, I think we're going to have to bring our Q&A session to an end. Obviously, unpacking the low and mid-rise reforms is no small task. Bridging the gap between state controls, local execution and market feasibility is exactly why we need sessions like this more. So can I please ask you to invite you to drinks after this, but also to thank the panel so much for being so amazing and answering all our questions. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.